Welcome to the Intrinsically Ordered Podcast. Today I'm joined by my friend Adam to talk through Jordan Peterson, somebody who we've both read a lot about. I have my critiques. Adam said I could introduce him as somebody who is, quote, doing tricks on it, unquote. And so today we're going to be talking through all of our hot takes on Jordan Peterson. We got a few different questions that Adam put together. I sent Adam my script and video on how Jordan Peterson made me an atheist. So we'll have a lot of discussions, but welcome to the show, Adam, after that voice crack that I just had.
Yeah, any point you make from here on out is like null and void. But thanks for having me, Cade. Yeah, I will make a slight amendment to what you just said, though, is that I wouldn't describe me as an expert. You have definitely read more than I have. But let me show you this. In my search for existential meaning right now, I've kind of developed a study guide that includes Peterson, but also, Young and Campbell. So I wish we were having this conversation like towards the end of it. Maybe we should when I get to the end of that, whenever that is. But for now, I can definitely ask questions and just get a deeper understanding of where you're coming from, because I watched your videos, I read your scripts, and some things, first off, there's like a lot we agree on, but then there are just slight things that I find really interesting about your perspective, and just out of curiosity, I would like to know more. But I guess the first thing I want to ask is something that stood out to me and that I just addressed before we went on, is that you said in the video you could barely get through, what's his newest one? We Who Wrestle with God. I was wondering why that is.
After I learned how to decipher and translate Jordan Peterson into accessible concepts, just the whole book, the magic was taken out of it. I feel like part of the magic of Peterson is that it's these big concepts, these big words, and you kind of I remember the first time I started reading him, you're trying to grasp on and figure out what he says. But after having spent so much time reading him, I found that We Who Wrestle with God just went in a circle of we have a hierarchy to things. We have this meta narrative that places us in this thing, and then we go through and prioritize based off of metaphorical substrates as we move through life. And also maybe another critique in that Peterson and I had a spicier exchange on was that I'm of the opinion that the Bible can't say anything. Like, the Bible is like a bunch of Lego pieces, and it says a ton of different verses out there, and that the only way for it to say something is for somebody to proof text and to find the quotes. And so once I was so when Jordan Peterson says that the waters, or the spirit moving over the waters means this, and in my head I'm it could also mean this, and people want to interpret it to mean this. He's not the infallible arbiter of the metaphorical meaning behind Scripture. And so it was both kind of it felt like it was just going in circles. And then once I was we don't know what the Scripture authors meant, then I was kind of and why would I trust Jordan Peterson over the church fathers? But those are kind of my 2 cents on it.
Well, what did that conversation get to? Was there a conclusion? Because I know this was Jubilee you're referring to, right?
We got to the point where when he was telling me his Bible stories, he would say a possible interpretation. And I think that's totally valid. And he's done a lot of work on, he always talks about large language models. And I was just listening to some of his more recent content. And he seems to think that the correct interpretation of Scripture is the most prolific one. And so when he looks at these language models, he's looking for these historical interpretations of Scripture. But I think whether you're Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox, that the interpretation with the largest volume of characters and the most replication across time isn't necessarily what the original authors intended. And so for that reason, I tend to look at Scripture verses and go, that can be interpreted in a number of different ways. And I didn't find that Jordan Peterson's interpretations were anything more groundbreaking than just going right to primary sources or actual scholarship.
Yeah, so coming from your perspective, having left the church, and also to an extent, I guess some people treat Peterson as a church, leaving that camp. What would, if I came to you and said, well, do you think there is a correct interpretation? Do you think there is a proper interpretation or a
of
more right
scripture.
interpretation? Yeah, yeah.
Um, Technically, no. Like, I don't think that we can have access to precisely what the authors intended. I think there's certainly interpretations that seem more plausible of a meaning of a meaning of what the original authors intended. Right? Like, does the spirit moving over the waters mean that like Baskin Robbins is the best ice cream place on planet Earth? Like, no. And so would Jordan Peterson's interpretation be more accurate or perhaps a better explanation of the data points? Yes. But I still don't think we can have absolute knowledge of what the authors intended. And I know like Alex O'Connor and Ruslan, who's another who's a Christian YouTuber, went
Mhm.
back and forth on Wes Huff, who was on the Joe Rogan Experience. So this is like
Yeah, yeah,
eight
yeah.
people down, and Wes made the claim that like word for word the Isaiah scroll is the same. And Alex's point is like, well, if you said it was almost all the way there, or for the sake of the conversation, like it's perfectly intact, that's one thing. To say it's word for word completely identical, even though it's from like
Identical to what?
99% to, so they're talking about the original Isaiah scrolls from the
Oh,
book of
okay.
Isaiah,
Okay.
and then they found them thousands of years later, and they realized that the copy that we have now lines up almost exactly to the original copies. Now it's between 80 and 100% depending on how you count the data. And their big debate was Westhoff saying it's exactly what we found historically. And then Joe Rogan asks him a question. He doubles down and says, word for word, it's the exact same. And even though the difference between like 99% and 100% is like 1%, it's still a massive leap from like something's generally accurate to 100% the truth. And so with Peterson on scripture, or really any scriptural interpretation, there are ones that seem more plausible. But I still don't think we can have absolute knowledge of what the authors intended, let alone this meta narrative through all of Scripture. I don't see how we can
Dude.
draw a through line between all of Scripture to have it speak univocally.
Okay, so this is something I think we're getting closer to my
Mhm.
interest here. First off, do you think authorial intent matters when it comes to scripture?
Like what the authors intended.
Right.
I think from a secular perspective, yes, that when when historians or critical scholars of scripture, not even critical scholars, but just scholars of scripture look at the books, I think we can start to approach what the author may have intended. I think the problem becomes how do we hermeneuticize, whatever the verb of a hermeneutic is, like through all of the New Testament? Like, how do we play together all of the Gospels and then all of Paul's writings and then some of the more anonymous New Testament books all the way through Revelation? And then how do we nest that inside of one giant narrative through all of Scripture? I don't think it's apparent that all of the authors of Scripture would have been on the same page
Mhm.
about God, about spirituality, about how they were writing, what they were being preserved from. So yeah, so from a secular perspective, I think yes, it's important to look at what the authors think. I think my problem is to make scripture univocal seems like an endeavor that can only happen if you first presuppose that it is univocal to harmonize all of these what seem to be contradictory ideas and verses into one narrative.
Okay. Yeah, so there's a lot to that. The second question is something I just want to get your opinion on, and correct me if I'm wrong in my interpretation of Peterson, but somewhere in that you emphasized the iteration of, I guess interpretation. And see, this is something I'm still trying to grapple with is and maybe this is best saved for later in the conversation. We lay some more foundational assertions out there, but Peterson has this idea of, first off, I would say he believes in an objective truth, or at least true enough, and in almost a pragmatic sense. And I can try to explain that if that doesn't make sense. This conversation will take me to the limits of my intellectual ability as is, but and this is also where I feel like, and I can't quite articulate it, but you're coming from a different perspective. So I guess the first question to ask is, Is that the correct interpretation as you see it, that Peterson believes in an objective truth to an extent and you find that truth through the manifestation and consequences of actions on, the scale and the time of evolution? So yeah, before I get ahead of myself, would you say that's a correct perspective on things?
I think Jordan Peterson, in the starts of conversations, begins to say something like that, of these like hyperreal meta truths or these archetypes that are present in the human spirit, and experience throughout time. But what I often find, in Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris have essentially 11 hours of just talking about like what is truth.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like Peterson has a much more utilitarian view of truth than any religious person would. Because in a certain sense, Peterson isn't primarily concerned about the physical interactions of the stories throughout Scripture, right? Jordan Peterson doesn't care if Jesus literally died, like his heart stopped and his body began decomposing as a matter of like, there's more of like the correspondence view of truth, which is the idea that I have in my head lines up perfectly to kind of objective reality. So to say that like Jesus rose from the dead isn't a metaphorical truth. It's not a helpful truth. And the average Christian would say, like, if you brought the video camera back to the first century, Jesus would absolutely have risen from the grave. And every major story that you see throughout the New Testament, specifically in the Gospels, happened from a objective standpoint. But Peterson doesn't seem to care so much about the physical world. He seems to really only care about our ability to efficiently move through and sort data, and that we need these hermeneutics and these heuristics to move through the world. Like the line from Maps of Meaning is that the world isn't just a plane of existence, it's a forum for action. And what he means is that we don't do science to figure out what spouse we should have. We don't do raw calculations to figure out should we go to ice cream with our kids. We have this, we look at the world and there are so many data points, so many possible decisions that we have to prioritize and hierarchize or make the data hierarchical.
Mm-hmm.
And Peterson seems to see belief and truth as things that you would die for. And famously, he historically has answered, like, did Jesus rise from the dead? Did Jesus rise from the dead? He's like, I'd need 9 answers to answer that. And if you just had a pure correspondence view of truth, an objective view of truth, that'd be a really easy answer, right? Either yes, no, or some degree in between, right? I'm 50% confident. But he seems to see truth as what is proximate to the human experience, right? Like my parents tragically dying in a car crash is more true than like somebody else's parents on the same day dying in a car accident. That truth seems to be a conglomeration of proximity, of utility, of fruitfulness, of some sort of transcendent spirit to it, rather than a more like scientific view of truth. So all to say is, yeah.
So would you say that he does value metaphorical truth? Because I think I heard in there that you said not quite. Am I wrong?
Peterson cares more about metaphorical truth than he does about literal truth. Right? He doesn't care about, like, if in the Jubilee debate, there's a great exchange there's a pen on the table, and Parker's asking, and they're talking about belief, right? Everybody has a belief system. Everybody has faith, whatever the vibe is. And Parker points out, like, I believe that this pen is here. And Peterson says, no. Belief is what you would die for. And Parker's like, I wouldn't die for this pen in front of me, right? Like, if there's a gun to my head and they're like, say that you're talking to Adam, or deny that you're talking to Adam right now, I'd be like, yeah, I'm not talking to Adam right now if there's a gun to my head. Even though I know that what is true, what corresponds to the physical world is that we are talking. And so Peterson sees like belief and truth as these such proximate, cataclysmic, and beautiful tales that we tell ourselves. And that's the epitome of truth, not how many milliliters of a substance can you pipette during a lab experiment?
Okay, now, okay, I'm gonna stick with this. So
Yeah.
now I just want to know, for clarity, what do you make of that? Are you on the same page? Because you did find meaning through Jordan Peterson's work. So to what
Mhm.
degree do you differ with that assumption?
I think, like with most things with Jordan Peterson, I'm like 96% of the way there. I think that absolutely, like the stories that we tell ourselves and the people that we surround ourselves and the beliefs that we have and the transcendent experiences that we have moving through life, the goodness, truth, and beauty are more proximate. They weigh on us more. They're much more integral to living a good life than pure correspondence theory on science. I think where I disagree with him is that, technically speaking, like I wouldn't use truth to describe the story of Cain and Abel or the Exodus, right? He's like, when he's asked about did the Exodus happen, he's like, yes, and it's still happening.
Mm.
And so I think he purposefully obfuscates between the two. And I think there are many beliefs and many practices and many habits that I have in my life that are beautiful, that bring me utility, that I love, but that aren't true. Like, is running true? Right? I do a lot of running, and so if somebody said like, "Is running true?" I'd be like, that's not like the right word. Is it helpful for me? Yes. Is it beautiful for me? Does it give me a sense of peace? Does it keep me in shape? Yes. I tend to see truth more as predictive utility, which is really only relegated to the sciences, in that my belief that the table is right behind this camera has predictive utility, because if I run full speed into it, I know 100 out of 100 times I'm going to hit my shins on it. Or when it comes to scientific theories of, like, we might not be able to see electrons per se, but that we know when we connect a circuit, like we have predictive utility. We know when we turn the light switch on, it's going to turn on. So I agree with him that metaphorical ideas and metaphorical substrates are very, very important, and oftentimes more pressing and take up more of our attention than truth, technically speaking. But I think he likes to obfuscate the two for the sake of, I don't know what the motives would be there, but he seems to purposely obfuscate those kind of two camps.
Okay. Now let me see if I can find my way to what exactly I'm trying to get at. Do you believe that there are qualitative differences between people's truths?
Qualitative, as in degrees of accuracy or degrees of utility?
Well, that's the question.
And the answer
Do
would
you
be
think
yes to
utility
both.
can represent accuracy?
I think in the proper domain, like I think of, once again, to go back to an example, to bring this back to reality with ultra marathoning, there are a lot of different techniques and strategies when it comes to food and or hydration and nutrition and foot care. And do you run fast at the start and slow down, or do you go slow at the start and like speed up, or you try to stay level throughout the race? So right there are a plethora of options when it comes to something objective, which is to say, like, finish a 100-mile race. And so even though, let's say, eating a certain amount of food every hour it's not an empirical truth. I think what you're getting at is that running a race two different ways. One's going to get you to the finish line more predictably. One's going to be easier on the body. And even though a race strategy isn't an empirical truth, I think it does kind of go between a metaphorical slash non-empirical claim and halfway between an empirical claim. I don't know if that answers your question, but yes, there are more. I would say there are more true ways to run a race. Is there the perfect way to run a race, right? If we're talking about a hierarchy, is there the perfect way to run a race? No. But are there degrees of like really bad ideas and really good ideas? Absolutely.
And that's what you subscribe to.
Yeah,
Because that's
I
what I'm
think
trying to get at, is more just like what's your perspective on things? What runs your life? Like, how do you interpret that wisdom, and where do you differ from it?
I think I differ in Peterson in that I don't have an incentive to purposefully muddy the waters between all of them. So, for example, if we use, once again, this running example, like running a race is halfway between a transcendent goal, which is like running 100 miles,
Mm-hmm.
and it's also partway between an empirical claim, because like what your body can metabolize is an empirical claim, and like what your muscle load can contain is an empirical claim. But I think instead of looking at like degrees of left to right, it's almost, we're gonna have to flip it where in a nutritional debate, or think about politics, something that you're involved in. I think there are objective facts, let's say about the data of economics, right? It is objectively true that this study surveyed this number of people and they reported this number. Like that's objectively true that that study did a thing. I think then we can go to a slightly more extrapolated truth, which is it seems like all these studies seem to be saying that X causes Y, right? We have the data and we have the correlation, but I wouldn't say that's in the same truth as like the objective data. And then above that is like the value systems that we have, right? Do you think about tariffs, for example? There's pros and cons on either side, and there's objective data behind having tariffs and not having tariffs. And so at a certain point, we do have to make a value judgment, right? Like tariff should be 84% is a should claim. It's not an empirical claim, but it kind of dips its toes into objectivity. And so I think where I differ with Jordan Peterson is that I can look at different epistemological levels of a particular conclusion and delineate them clearly for the audience, versus it seems like Peterson seems to say the data around a survey is the same thing as reading scripture. They're both equally true. I think you could use truth, but I think they're equivocating, and that what we mean by true aren't even remotely similar in the two. And what I'd like to see from him is more clarity on what he means, because he seems to muddle the water in a way that's advantageous to his career.
Okay. See, I don't want any dead air, but like I have a transcript from something I've been referencing because I have the same question sometimes.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, if you want to take a second to read through it, I'll go through and edit this. Yeah.
In here somewhere he talks about his definition of truth, and he's talking with, Brett Weinstein, and I don't know why I find so silly to be citing the Joe Rogan podcast, but the conversation did happen there.
Yeah.
And I thought it was fruitful, but in it, it's his whole dialogue really, and he's bouncing off Brett as they zero in on what exactly he means by truth. Brett proposes this idea of metaphorical truth from literal and just gets down to the core of it, and they hit the core, and I have it somewhere marked in here, and what they come to is that, yes, how we use true in today's world is different from empirical truth per se. How Peterson interprets true is, and I'll just have to find it, but just a taste of what it was that, like an arrow, maybe this was a passage in the Bible or something he cited, I wasn't quite sure, but an arrow flies straight and true to its destination. So, and I don't even quite know what to make of that. I have to find it. So could I get a minute to try to find that?
Yeah, for sure.
All right, I found the passage. He's responding to Brett, so I figured it'd be good to get some context. I don't remember quite exactly what he's responding to, so we're going to figure it out as we go. So Brett says, all I'm saying is that, and he uses this example throughout the conversation, that a metaphorical truth versus a literal is if you believe that a porcupine quills can be thrown and shot at you, it's not literally true, but you may, you'll have a better outcome in the literal world. Like you won't be touching porcupines, as opposed to someone who doesn't have that truth, and evolutionarily, it may prove beneficial. So that's the example he's referring to in this conversation. He says, all I'm saying is that the belief in quills as projectiles is likely to be the product of selection, as in evolution, at least holding that belief. In other words, those people who had encoded that they do throw their quills have an advantage. It's not the way I would do it, for exactly the reason that you point out, and he's pointing out that Joe mentioned, why not just tell them the actual truth, right? So Brett says, I wouldn't do it for exactly that reason, lie to them. which is if you give the child the wrong model of a porcupine, I don't know whether a porcupine is liable to be the gateway to some more important question. But if it were, you just steered that kid wrong. And so this is where Jordan Peterson kind of gets closer to his definition of truth. He says, well, something here is part of the problem, and it's a really big problem. So there's two things that were brought up by what Brett just described. And the first is the terminology of truth. And this is something I would like your opinion on, Cade, after I finish. He says, now, Sam Harris's claim with regards to my utilization of truth was that I was absconding with the definition of truth, and in a false manner. But he was wrong, because the idea of truth is much older than the idea of objective truth. And the original notion of truth wasn't objectively true. It was like the arrow flies straight and true, right? It meant something like reliably on its way to the appropriate destination, something like that. And when Christ said, I am the truth and the way, what he's talking about wasn't an objective truth. And so Peterson says, so Sam's idea that I had somehow taken the idea of truth that was actually objective all along and done something crooked with it is just wrong. It's wrong. So, I don't know, what do you make of that?
I find so many of these conversations to be, how would I put this? It seems like everybody on the table is on the same page. They're just arguing about how to market the idea, right? Like Jordan Peterson understands that physical reality is real. And Sam Harris understands that metaphorical ideas are pertinent, helpful, and integral for us navigating the world. And in this weird way, it's almost like both sides can't comprehend the fact that the average person's able to comprehend both of those at the same time. They seem, in all of these conversations, seem to think that, like, those idiots out there who can't understand what we're talking about, we have to, like, settle it between ourselves to figure out, like, how we sell this to the masses. But I think that the average person is able to, for example, in the porcupine example, realize that, like, yeah, it's probably a good idea to, like, teach your kids that porcupines can throw their quills, and that's going to get your kid to get away from it. And then as the kid gets older, and maybe your kid wants to go off to college to be a biologist, and you'd sit them down and be like, I wasn't lying to you, right? It's not that porcupines are these giant fluffy stuffed animals that, like, you could have hugged your whole childhood, but, like, I protected you from something. I communicated the essence of how it is that I want to move through the world. And now that you are going to have a much higher resolution view of this issue, which is like porcupines when you study them in college, you should probably realize that porcupines don't have this mechanism by which they can throw quills like 10 feet right into your eyeball. And so, yeah, all to say, I think I agree with both sides.
Mm-hmm.
And where I think I disagree with them is that I think the average person is capable of understanding those equivocated terms of truth, and that I don't think we have to settle on them. Because even as somebody who doesn't, let's say, dogmatically believe in religion, I tend to still, I've dubbed it like the realm of the human spirit. Like when once again, to bring this back to running, like running 100 miles it's not an empirical truth. Like it's not something a fedora tipping atheist on Reddit would like post about. It's transcendent. You let go of logic. You experience something beyond yourself. It is a spiritual experience running for 30 hours out there in the mountains. But I don't think that is indicative of some alternative realm of reality that objectively exists out there in this like Platonic ideal or this transcendent being outside of time, space, and matter. In the same way that many psychologists, when they look at people with PTSD, like, is PTSD objective or subjective? There is disagreement, right? Like the same people can go through the same traumatic experience, and some people walk out fine, and some people walk out with extreme PTSD. And so is subjective the proper term? And the answer's like, no, like it is objectively true that somebody with PTSD, if you put them in an MRI, their brain's going to light up like fireworks to the same stimuli that somebody also experienced and doesn't have their brain light up. So it is objectively true that one person's brain lights up and one person's brain doesn't light up.
Mm-hmm.
But is subjective the right word? And the answer's like, no, because like there's objective data. So it's like, what do we make out of it? And like people can experience things in different ways. People can have a diversity of views on something that's happening while still remaining objective in their reporting of it. Because I often get into this conversation on like meta ethics of if a humanist comes to the conversation and says, I want people to flourish. A lot of times the overly zealous presuppositionalist is going to go, but human flourishing isn't objective. To which the answer is like, kind of, but also not really, where something like human flourishing is a constellation of objective data filtered through a value set. So is it objectively true that people in Sweden report a higher happiness level than people in the US? That is at the same time objective, and it's also not an empirical claim apart from our subjective experience of the world, right? The people in Sweden and America aren't lying. There's something objective. But then we also have to filter through the value judgment of like, well, yeah, I mean, happiness is kind of synonymous with human flourishing. Health is kind of synonymous with human flourishing, right? I think there's room for constellations, for purposefully unequivocating terms and recognizing what the other person is trying to encode when they're talking to you.
Okay, so you mentioned, and this is something fundamental. So you mentioned, what do we make of it? That being truth. And I think I've written down here that, and I would say this is accurate, that Peterson boils down his fundamental disagreements with the Harris-Dawkins types, which is that, truth, not in the arrow sense that we fly straight and true to our appropriate destination, just truths as in objective facts, don't tell us how to act. So, what do you make of that?
I think Harris and Peterson's main controversy is that Sam sees the empirical data as like framing in the meta truths, right? He would say that a meta truth or a metaphorical truth can never override this physical realm, right? So did the Exodus happen? Sam would say like, no, right? Like we can never override the fact that we don't have good archaeological proof for the concept of millions of people going through the desert in that time. I think what Peterson says is almost that the, let's say, empirical reality can be overridden by
like you said, you say it's
helpful.
Still happening, right?
Yeah, it's still happening.
Yeah, and not to cut you off, but this is like where I'm interested in is like, and maybe you've already said it, but it's just not registering with me. Where do you stand in that? Like, even examples in life. If I told you, did Cain and Abel happen? Are you the type of person to tell me it's still happening, or the Hawkins or Dawkins type that's like, no, it never happened. It's a fairy tale. And because you mentioned you're able to hold these dualities, right?
Yeah.
That most people are, right? And these two figureheads battling it out for which one's right. They're not able to. So I'm just interested in how you interpret the world, especially from your incredibly personalized experience of entering the Catholic faith to such a dogmatic degree, and then exploring Peterson, and then now reeling back to this completely separate, aisle.
I think it's just to be cognizant or to recognize what's happening. I think for example, I think the porcupine example is a great example of this, where an overly zealous materialist is going to prosecute how you tell your kids about porcupines in a, how do you say this? Like, they'd probably be upset by you telling your kids that the porcupines can shoot their quills. But I think as a parent, as long as you realize that, like, I'm telling my kids a version of the truth,
Mhm.
and if they ever ask and they go like, but really, can this like really happen? Like, I want to read a book on it. That's kind of where you go like, well, not really.
So that's how you would take it. Like if you were a
Yeah,
parent, that's the approach you would have.
yeah. I think a lot of things get simplified.
Right.
And I think as long as we recognize that they're a simplification and then you can unpack them to a higher degree, um, in many ways, like the statement, I put out a video on like the Catholic Church doesn't know what can send you to hell. Is like, is that true? Kind of. Is that the whole truth? No. But does it communicate something at a basic level to somebody who doesn't understand the difference between grave matter and venial sins, and then having the conditions needed to make a grave sin a mortal sin? Like there's so much to unpack there. And then you like throw in levels of like the magisterium, and then like you throw in saint quotes and tradition. So the statement, the Catholic Church doesn't know what can send you to hell, is true, but it is an oversimplification. That I'm okay putting that as a title of a video. I'm okay
Mhm.
communicating that to people when they ask me questions. But at the same time, if they then ask me, tell me more about that, I'm not going to just give them that same level of understanding back. And so I think when you talk to, let's say, your kids about whether it's Santa Claus or porcupines or even the phrase like stranger danger, like, is that true? Does that maybe another thing to say here is that like that truth doesn't exhaust the category of what it's trying to communicate. Where
Mhm.
like stranger danger is true in that, can strangers be dangerous? Yes. Doesn't mean that every stranger is dangerous. No. So it's a non-exhaustive statement, but yet an extraction that's helpful to kids. And then now once you get older and you turn 16, your parents, or not before you're 16, when you're much younger, your parents might say stranger danger, but also if they're cops, you can trust them. But then once the kid gets a little bit older, that statement in of itself isn't exhaustive. You might be like, well, there are cases in which people impersonate the cops. And so, like, if you're ever in doubt if the cop is an actual cop, you can just call 911 and have them verify. Like, we have this Russian nesting doll of, like, these ideas of truth, and it seems like no one statement is ever perfectly exhaustive of the message that's trying to be encoded by the person speaking, and that seems to always get lost in translation to the person receiving and decoding that. Um, and also, once again, to bring this back to running, right? So how do I hold the two together? If I'm in a really dark place in the race and I go, I can't quit this race and go back to my family and tell them that I quit, is something that it is true in that it's helpful for me. It keeps me in the race and it approximates some semblance of the truth. But if I was to really sit down and like analyze that with a fine tooth comb, like my family wouldn't renounce me. They wouldn't really even make fun of me. Like they wouldn't be upset with me quitting. But in the context of the race, I'm not going to allow my brain to like escape that way. I'm going to
Mhm.
hold this truth because it is so helpful in a race that I'm going to purposefully deceive myself because it is helpful. And that's an example of like Jordan Peterson would say, you're overriding the empirical truth, which is my family's not going to be upset with me. And I would go further than Sam in that I think that it's okay to step beyond the empirical claim because it is helpful for staying in the race when I'm sleep deprived and hallucinating submarines in the middle of the woods.
So let's take that to your exploration and embrace of Christianity. You've left the church. Have you extracted anything from the religion? Because here's where I find you incredibly interesting, Cade. I was actually talking to Raph, our friend, about this the other day. And I don't mean this in like a derogatory way, but you're you're almost an extremist in a way, and I'll put it this way. What I mean by that is, from the little I know about your life and that you've been willing to share, not that you've been unwilling to share anything, is that you've applied yourself so rigorously to your pursuits of whatever it is you're searching for. Like, I guess when it was entering the church, it was, for lack of better words, to de-gay yourself, or however you want to put it. I mean, you were incredibly, incredibly devout. And when you mentioned in your video about how Jordan Peterson made you an atheist, that he also made you less dogmatic, which I totally see. I'm probably not very dogmatic as a person because of him as well. But then you seem to, now you define yourself as an atheist, and I know there's a journey that takes you there, but to someone in my position who doesn't have an inside window into your life, you just seem to be going to these different polar extremes. And even in running, this seems to manifest in your life. You know, very few people pick up a sport where you just like run 60 miles at a time and start hallucinating submarines. So there's a lot of different things. That's a whole nother conversation I'd like to have with you. Maybe what you interpret about that. But my question was, did you extract anything from the Christian faith that you still keep with you? And if you did, what is it? And most importantly, why?
Let me back up to something you said in the middle on being an extremist. And I think the answer is absolutely yes. Like from the time I've been little, I have delved like headfirst into everything that I've been in pursuit of. And so I think it is absolutely a valid, but more than valid, a helpful thing. And I tell this to people on the internet, or many people that reach out to me, that like I'm somebody who goes extreme in every direction. And probably the fact of me going from extreme on religion to the opposite direction is probably a sign that there is something about my own interior experience of the world which makes me gravitate towards the extremes. And that if you can find the middle, that's absolutely probably where you should end up. Because I think being on the extreme of anything, whether pro or anti-religion, or this party or that party, or this hobby or that other party, is going to have its drawbacks. I also think, in the context specifically of being Catholic, that unfortunately there isn't much room to be gray in the middle, especially while being gay, in that I think that if the church were if the church were socially accepting of being in the gray area, I don't think I would have left. Because I think leaving was a very difficult time in my life. And if I could have found a way, 1 foot in, 1 foot out, would have been helpful. And I see that in a number of people who are gay and Catholic or trans and Catholic, like whatever it is, they've managed to keep a foot in both sides. And I think that their life is better for being in both of those realms, right? The technical sense of truth and the metaphorical sense of truth, while still having this transcendent gravitas to something that might be like subjectively true. And so is there something that I've kept from religion? I think the answer is absolutely. And what often puzzles people that both know my online presence and my in-person, like just being a normal person, is that they seem to be totally incongruous. In most people that I know assume that I'm part of their religion. On many Muslim holidays, I have Muslim friends that still to this day think that I'm, not that I'm a devout Muslim, but that I really look up to the faith. In the same way on Easter, to have a number of Happy Easter texts roll in, and also on my end to text other people Happy Easter. And so in person, I think that the average person, when they look at religion, is something beautiful, it's something transcendent, it is something real in their life that I would never want to take away from somebody. I think of my mother, who's Catholic. She goes to Mass on the weekends, and she's able to line up to most Catholic beliefs and then take some liberty on others. And like, I wish I could do that in many ways. And so like, what's the discrepancy between in person, everybody thinks I agree with them, and I don't ever try to take religion away from people, versus my online presence? And I think that the central issue is dogma. And what I mean by that is the apologists that I talk to are of the persuasion that every Catholic dogma around Mary, around the Ascension, around the Assumption, around the Immaculate Conception, around the hypostatic union are objectively true and truer in a way that science is true. And that's where I push back. Or is being gay wrong? These were the people that would say, under no circumstance ever can it be life-giving to enter into a lifelong committed relationship that should be socially recognized between members of the same sex. I think most of my online presence is only in response to that dogmatic way, and that I tend to take a hammer to. But yet I think in many ways, when I attend a weekly Bible study of Protestant dads because I find it fascinating from an anthropological perspective. That I think religion, and so when people ask me, like, is God real? I tend to say yes, like, he's real for so many people. Like, it is objectively true. I don't think that religious people are deceiving themselves. I don't think that they're jumping to unwarranted conclusions. I don't think that they're doing anything bad. And I think in many ways, the one prompt that Peterson never got to get to on Jubilee is that every faith system, or every system of belief starts with faith. And many of his other prompts on, like, everybody's religious. And I agree with it, right? Like, does everybody have a God that they worship? If by God we mean hierarchical transcendent good, yes. Does everybody have faith in things? Absolutely. And so in casual conversation, I don't really ever push back on these ideals that are going back and forth. What gets my spidey senses up and what gets me riled up and what I like to call out is when Jordan Peterson says, everybody worships something. I would agree with that if I'm talking to my friend at Starbucks. But when you're in the context of Jordan Peterson, who makes a ton of money off of what I think is purposeful grifting, that is often used to lash out and harm people in the queer community, or these weird right-wing positions that come from, like, these partially true, non-exhaustive, but yet still accurate in some way statements, that's what I'm pushing back against. And him and I have talked about this. It's like, yeah, if you define God as something so big, then absolutely I believe in God. But also, if I define atheism as just being non-dogmatic, then Jordan Peterson's roped into my camp, which is not believing dogmatically and not attending a church on the regular weekend. And I feel like so much of this is all served by just whatever word people are debating, delete that word and just use the longer, more complex phrase. And it seems like we're all kind of on the same page.
Okay, that helps a lot. So just to make sure I have the proper understanding.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not quite sure I do, because there's a little thing at the end about... No, I think I do understand. So the bulk of your, which is like the 4%, if you believe in 90%, or agree with 96%, is mostly just, I forget how exactly you put it, but more just his beliefs in action, more so how he tweets, and the conversations he sparks in other subcultures of the internet.
Correct?
Yeah. Okay. Well,
yeah.
Man, there's a lot we could go down, but okay. I think this is the route I want to go down that I'm interested in. In your video, you mentioned that, let me see if I can find the exact words, but you mentioned that you learned from Peterson all the fruits you received from Catholicism, right? They were extracted not from the definitive presence of an actual God, God as Catholicism knows him, or any other religion, right? It was your belief in that God. And this is where I'm curious, you've left the church. What is your God? Because, one of my interpretations of your video was that it seemed to me that you were saying, I don't need God. I realized that that the fruits I extracted from my practice of Catholicism was just in the belief. And I'm assuming watching that you still have those fruits. So first off, is that correct? Like, do you still find meaning in your life, or are you on a search right now? You do?
When I first left Catholicism, I think the thing that kept me in Catholicism long enough is that without God, without this objective God, that life doesn't have meaning. And it took a long time and talking to a lot of people to figure out my own thoughts on the matter when it comes to meaning, purpose, community, transcendent spirituality. Because, like, once again, I agree with the sentiment that everybody worships something, right? Like, I'm on board with that.
Hmm.
That everybody has a God-shaped hole in their heart. If by God we just mean a transcendent reality, absolutely. Like, I think every person looks to, when they think about their life, they don't think about like ATP happening in their souls. They don't think about like the return of the stock market in 40 years. They're approaching these transcendentals and these transcendent ideas. And so does every healthy person have spirituality? Yes. And so once again, like, all of these statements, I agree with, if what we mean is let's have an honest exploration of how people can have transcendent experiences or transcendent beliefs and spiritual experiences in their life. Awesome. I think the only time that I start pushing back, and you'll see this once my debate with Peterson goes live, is that if he was somebody on the street, I'd agree with nearly everything he says. But because when people say, oh, there's a God-shaped hole in your heart, if what they mean is, let's get you connected to spirituality, I think the answer is absolutely. I think everybody is on that. What my problem is, and where I start pushing back on seemingly benign phrases, is what they mean by everybody has a God-shaped hole in their heart means thou must join the Catholic Church and prescribe all of these particular codes on what you can and can't do on weekends and what dances you can and can't do, and sexual ethics and marriage and monarchy and all of these things.
So if I
Yeah.
can just jump in, when Jordan
Mhm.
says, and this is what I'm still like having trouble understanding, and maybe I just don't have enough context, but you would agree with him on the street, and I get
Yep.
the street is the context of a more casual approach to this kind of
Yeah.
conversation, but disagree with him in the debate. Again, why is that?
Because it is a tool that is used to force other people into lives that they don't want to live.
Okay. And so, completely understand now. Same
Mhm.
page. However, there's a question, and you believe that that is Jordan Peterson's motivation? Or do you just believe it's an actual effect?
I think that Jordan Peterson is smart and realizes that his work is used to move people towards religion. I think that many of the beliefs that Jordan Peterson have are wildly incongruous with the bulk of his work, specifically like talking about let's say the Bible is true. He demands this huge level of nuance, this such complexity that the outside world doesn't understand.
Mm.
But when he's talking about Elliot Page's gender affirming care surgeon, the answer is this guy's worse than the Nazis and he should be locked up. Right? I think it is. I think it is. If we want to have let's really look at these really complex issues with an honest and very nuanced approach, I think I'm on the same page, right? If we say, let's look at the idea of God in a really nuanced and thoughtful way, absolutely. As long as when we're talking about people receiving gender affirming care or being married to members of the same sex or immigrating to another country, I think those aren't cut and dry issues. I think those are very complex issues. And so it seems incongruous for Jordan Peterson to demand a level of nuance beyond what is immediately perceptible by people listening on religion, and then strike out and lash out in such objective and non-nuanced way on random policy positions. Same thing with climate change. It seems incongruous. And so what are his intentions and motivations? I'm not exactly sure, other than he knows what he's saying. He knows how people understand that. He knows what his work is being used towards, and he knows his own opinions on very specific policy positions. And I have no way to put all of those together other than to have my spidey senses kick in and start to stall the conversation and dig my heels into the ground, because I know where this is going based off of what he tweets about on the internet.
Okay, I understand. But that's not what you argued with him about on the Jubilee debate, no?
Let me pull up the actual prompt here. Will be helpful.
because I that's a road, I can't speak for Peterson, but we all have our own interpretations of his work. I mean, yours was completely different from that uh ultimate consequence you see coming from, his X page or whatever. Um and so I'd push back a little bit and say there is a bit of subjectivity to that.
Mhm.
And maybe it's utilitarian and therefore not even worth having the discussion to say, okay, well, is he more of a good for this world or more of a bad? I don't find any use in that conversation. But yeah, so I guess I'm just interested in what exactly did you feel that is that why you went to Jubilee? And did you get, because you agree with them on everything or mostly everything else. Like if you saw him on the street. So my confusion is just, what was the disagreement in that debate?
So the topic that I specifically spoke on, and I was the first to go in our episode,
Mhm.
one, atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting. Him and I started off with like, essentially, I was more religious than Jordan Peterson ever has been in his life. Um, and so,
Okay, so there was an actual disagreement there. I can see that.
yes, on
Because
that
you're
one,
coming from.
yeah,
Go ahead.
the second prompt that I didn't get to speak on is morality and purpose cannot be found within science. And I fully agree there. I don't think that people go home from their job and have like a shrine to particle physics, or like when their grandma's dying, they don't find meaning through like titrating various chemicals in the lab. Or when somebody passes away, they're not like, oh, I wonder how many milligrams of fluid this person had in them. Like, no, like our experience of the human person is not simply atoms coming together. Um, and so, once again, like morality and purpose cannot be found within science. I think I agree. I think the problem becomes in my one of my big qualms with Peterson is that he just leaves it there, right? Morality and purpose cannot be found within science. And he seems to never clarify the so what to a degree where I don't trust that he's just interested in descriptive statements. Um, there are many philosophers and many people that I would talk to where they'd say morality and purpose cannot be found within science, and they leave it there. And it's not in a way that overrides science. It's a way in which we can recognize what science is, recognize what it does for us, put it in a box, and then set that on the shelf, and then next to the shelf, kind of build off of that into these transcendental truths.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my problem with him is that he obfuscates his so what. Even in the title of the video, One Christian versus 25 Atheists, he refused to admit to being Christian on a number of occasions. I don't know how many will make it to the final edit. And you're like, I think my central qualm with him is like, he knows that he does not believe in the way that other people think that he believes. And he's smart enough to recognize that and smart enough to recognize that he makes money off of that. Right? I think if you took the average Peterson fan, if you surveyed people who've read 12 Rules for Life and had them explain to you what they think Jordan Peterson thinks about God, would be wildly incongruous with what
Yeah.
Jordan Peterson actually means. And he seems to, right, and this is getting more into the intentions.
Mm-hmm.
He makes a shit ton of money off of this.
Right.
A ton of money off of this. And he seems to, and maybe I'd also put it this way, I think if everybody realized what he was actually saying, his fan base would be cut by 75%. And so, like, are 25% of the people very interested in his work? Like, with Maps of Meaning, if he was still writing Maps of Meaning, I would be a gung-ho Jordan Peterson fan. I'd be part of the 25% that would stick around after they figured out what he was saying, because I think what he's saying is very important and very fun and great. I think what I dislike about him, what I find disingenuous and problematic about him, is that he knows that 75% of the people that read his book get a very different impression, like him for those reasons that aren't the actual things that he believes, and he both has fame and money built off of the backs of people that are purposefully and deliberately not informed as to the actual reality of what he believes.
Yeah, there's an interesting conversation that can be had about, his intentions, and we could pull up examples. But I only have a few minutes left here.
Mhm.
So so I've gotten what I wanted from this conversation.
Yeah.
I hope it was like interesting to other people. But
Yes.
it's really just to find where exactly you and Peterson's alignment was and where it differs.
Mhm.
And I want to like take a deep dive into where you differ now that I have a good understanding of it.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe we just choose one thing that you disagree with him on in terms of, modern politics. Is there like a list of your grievances against them?
On his philosophy in religion, or
Yeah, like
specifically on politics?
trans
Yeah.
rights. Maybe you want to talk about, you mentioned this in the video, which was incredibly
Mhm.
interesting to me, is the fact that the Catholic Church doesn't offer a solution to, maybe we talk about this, because the Catholic Church, you mentioned, dogmatic. Absolutely. I found, while I'm not a practicing Catholic, I'm incredibly, I admire the faith, and really just anybody who's of true faith, and their devotion to that. But I found, traveling this life, that, there's a spectrum. Of course, you have dogma and institution, which has its values, and then you have decentralization, which has its values, but both also have horrible, horrible consequences with them. You went the institution route, and we know how they stand on homosexuality and whatnot today. But where do you think the Catholic Church can change? Even if it's
Mhm.
incredibly unlikely. Is there a place it can change, or is it just structurally unsound? To give meaning, that is.
Yeah.
To give meaning to people with or people who are homosexual.
I think I take a very Jordan Peterson approach to answering the question, which is like, what is the Catholic Church? And I think it's, for the sake of the Wikipedia article, like, it's a really easy thing. It's a worldwide institution that kind of centers its hierarchy around Rome. But I think I can recognize that, like, the hierarchy and the teaching apparatus, or the alleged teaching apparatus, is not the same as the lived reality. That I think if we look at Catholicism as a cultural, a spiritual, a anthropological, and a historical lived reality, I think it's absolutely beautiful. I think anybody who's traveled to South America, where Catholicism is so deeply intertwined into people's lives, but in a way that is still, in a certain way, like, grows out of these older indigenous beliefs, and in many ways melds too close together for the folks in Rome. That I think what somebody in rural Central America, who's combined their ancestral religions with Catholicism, which, being around for hundreds of years, has been combined into one, and is a way that provides meaning for them. It provides community for them. It provides structure for them. It provides peace for them when they look at the world. And they might have the wrong beliefs according to Rome. I find that faith to be incredible. I think there's the movie Conclave, and I believe one of the lines is that, like, certainty cheapens faith. And that I think that spirituality, I think that religion, and that's why when I talk to the average person on the street, when I have friends in my life, I do nothing but support their religion. I have one of the guests that I've had on my show who's new to the faith. I was congratulating him on joining the church here this Easter. He was officially joined the Catholic Church, because I think I can separate in the individual person, like, the catechism and these old documents from the 1500s in Rome isn't what somebody means by Catholicism when they're talking about their own experience of the world. Or my friend who's Muslim, and throughout Ramadan we were sending memes. Then at the end we had a celebration together. It's like, I think that's a beautiful expression of the human experience. The only thing that I differ on is just the so what. I think that what Peterson talks about is a tool, right? So we look at hierarchies, we look at meaning, we look at archetypes, we look at hyper-real meta-truths, we talk about meta-narratives. If what we use those tools and those concepts for is to look at the world and to say, what we're approaching religion is a beautiful thing, and so let's not go to war over religion, let's not force these transcendent or hyper-real subjective meta-truths on the rest of society. Let's find a way in which everybody can come to the table and have their own metaphorical substrate that they exist within so that they can flourish. If that's the direction that we want to go with Peterson's work, I think it's a beautiful thing. And one of my friends, Brandon Robertson, who's a big LGBT pastor in New York, he's very much on the Jordan Peterson school of thought, because what he says, when people come into his church that have been harmed by conversion therapy, by dogmatism, by these harmful pastors, he wants people to stay religious. And what he means by religious is to transcend this mortal coil that we're in, that to get beyond just the tragedy of life and to see beauty and the poetic justice in there. I think that is a beautiful use of what Peterson says. But what I often find the case is that people go down the Peterson rabbit hole, and instead of becoming more caring, more empathetic, caring more about the human experience and looking at people with nuance, they see what Peterson says and they become more radicalized. They seem to disparage other religions, to tell people what to believe, to not care about people's very near and dear experiences of, let's say, gender dysphoria or the gender through which they want to live in life, which gender is an entirely social construct, and an important one at that. And we could apply Peterson's framework to gender and, like, at the same time be able to condemn the ardent woke people that are so religious and dogmatic about non-religion that they harm people, while also calling out the people that want to take away care from people and subjugate and shame other people. But what I often find is that people do go down that latter route with Peterson, where they become radicalized, they stop caring, they become so preconceived with their own subjective experience of these archetypal stories that they see them as more objective than data around matters that actually make people's lives better. So it's really just about the direction that you're going. Right in the same way, maybe a random example to throw in there is if somebody in my family goes missing and the cops ask me, what were you doing last night? And they mean to ask, like, oh, we just are honestly curious about where you were so we can help find a family member. It'd be like, awesome, I'm answering those questions. But if I get the sense that, like, they're trying to convict me of a crime that I know I didn't commit, like, I'm going to call my lawyer at that point, right? It's one question, but the direction that we're going are very, very different. And so I'm going to react appropriately because I don't want to self-incriminate and go to jail for something that I didn't do. But also, if I know that they have good intentions, I want to find that family member too. And so I'm going to give them more data than they could imagine. Is kind of a weird example to throw in there, but it's really about the direction that people are going that I find most important. The same way
No, I feel like that's almost a perfect place to stop if I can't ask any more questions, which I can't because I have to go, unfortunately. But maybe another time, either in person or some other format, I'd love to get your thoughts on just social issues today, such as like LGBTQ and anyways, there's a whole list. But I hope that was, useful for people who, your audience, it may be a big nothing burger to a lot of people. It's like, okay, so we agree. But I don't know. I found that very useful, especially coming from the context of, your debate with Peterson. So I don't know. I hope I did well, Cade, but I found it.
I think you asked the perfect questions, and I think that it was quite helpful both of clarifying my own thoughts, and I will definitely pull my own transcript and be like, oh, it's a phrase or an idea that I got to use later. So I appreciate you asking the questions, and hopefully I didn't word salad too hard and confuse you more than before.
No, not at all, my friend.
Awesome. Well, we shall let you head out here, and I think definitely tagging social issues some point would be awesome.
Awesome. All right. Appreciate it, buddy.
Awesome. Talk soon.